Thanks, y'all, for joining us. My name's Lynn Farland. I'm the canon for formation for the diocese, and I'm also a member of the Repairers of the Breach task force, which is hosting tonight's event. And so again, just the housekeeping, if we could stay muted and off video as much as possible, that will help. Feel free to use the chat. I'll try to monitor that and share with Jennifer, or Jennifer, maybe at some point, if you want to just ask what's going on, I can try to at least summarize what we've seen. We'll have time for questions at the end, so jot those questions down. We definitely want to hear from everybody. So let me just jump in. It's my pleasure to welcome and introduce you to Dr. Jennifer Oast, who is our presenter this evening. Repairers of the Breach thanks you for your time and your wisdom. Dr. Oast is a professor and chair of the Department of History at Bloomsburg University in Pennsylvania. And she's the author of Institutional Slavery, Slaveholding Churches, Schools, Colleges, and Businesses in Virginia from 1618 to 1860. That's published by Cambridge University Press. And she's a native Virginian, and she earned her PhD at the College of William and Mary in 2008. And it was there that she began her research, and that research informs her talk tonight. So Dr. Oast, welcome. We are starting a few minutes late, so I am going to turn it over to you right now. I will do a brief wishing blessings on you, and appreciate so much your willingness to talk with us tonight. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen with you all, and that's okay. It's going to stop the other screen sharing, so I hope that's okay. And okay, so everybody should be able to see my screen. Please tell me if you can't. It reads, Unlawful for any Christian, Slave-owning Anglican and Episcopal churches in early Virginia. And of course, there's a picture of Lynnhaven Parish Church in Williamsburg. And I just want to start by saying good evening and to thank you for coming out to this lecture tonight, and to thank the diocese for inviting me. Like many of you, I am a person of faith. And so I come to you tonight with a prayer in my heart that this presentation, in conjunction with the really good work that Repairers of the Breach is doing, will help you forward your goals of dismantling racism in your parishes. I believe that knowledge of the past is a firm foundation for a more just and peaceful future. And so that's what we're doing today, is just examining the history of this practice of slaveholding by Anglican and Episcopal churches. Now, the title begins, Unlawful for any Christian. And that is a quotation from an 18th century Anglican minister named Anthony Gavin. So here's the fuller context for the quotation. It gives me a great deal of uneasiness to see the greatest part of our brethren taken up in farming and buying slaves, which, in my humble opinion, is unlawful for any Christian, and in particular for a clergyman. And that was the Reverend Anthony Gavin, minister of St. James Parish in Goochland, Virginia, writing the Bishop of London in 1738. Unfortunately, he's in the minority. It's a wonderful thing, I think, that there are some people questioning slavery, and especially slave owning by church members. But for most, they accepted it in the colonial era as a part of life, maybe as a necessary evil. In fact, we'll see that many, if not most, ministers owned slaves, and many more employed slaves owned by their parishes. So to understand how this came to be, we need to have a little bit of general background on the coming of slavery to Virginia in the 17th century. Okay, so just a very quick background, because I don't know how much knowledge you all are bringing in, and I'm sure it's variable. So one thing to know is that the first recorded Africans arriving in Virginia occurred in 1619. On the screen, there's a painting that shows what this may have looked like.
Hi, I'm so sorry to interrupt. Your screen is not shared with us. We cannot see the picture you're referring to.
Oh, I'm very glad that you let me know that.
See it.
I'm sorry, did you say some can see it?
I can see it.
Yes, we have, Jennifer, we
I
have
can see
some
it.
folks who can see it and some who can't.
I can see it.
Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing and I'll try it again and see if it works better. Let's go ahead and try that again. I'll try it this way.
Actually, that's not working. You need to go into the view in the upper right corner. And for those folks who can't see it, they need to click on view and then side by side speaker.
I can see it now that you changed it. I definitely see your PowerPoint. Thank you.
But you need to remove your PowerPoint slides on the left margin though. Go back to your original screen. It wasn't you, Jennifer, that had the problem. I think it's the viewer.
Okay, but I'm definitely glad that we're fixing it for them though. So, all right, I'm going to try one more time. Okay. How is this for everyone now?
That looks good for me.
That's great. Thank you.
Works here.
Beautiful.
Works here.
Works here.
Thank you, everyone.
Good.
This feels just like I'm teaching class, which is all happening via Zoom these days. Okay, so one thing that I think is important to know is that England did not have laws governing or even permitting slavery in 1619. So when the first few slaves arrived, they weren't quite sure what to do with them. And in fact, we understand that the first slaves to arrive in Virginia were probably on a ship, maybe Dutch. Either way, they were probably destined to go to some other part of the Americas, maybe Brazil, maybe somewhere in the Caribbean. They end up here, and they were treated initially as indentured servants. Most of the workers who came to 17th century Virginia were indentured servants from the British Isles. They were really harshly overworked, and they suffered a great deal, but their situation was better than that of slaves because there was an end term to when their time of service would be over, and then they could, if things worked out well for them, have a better life here. In fact, they usually chose to be indentured servants, and there's so much more we could say about that. But to stay on track, we want to focus on the fact that by the middle of the 17th century, the leaders of the colony started to question, why are we allowing individuals to get their freedom when in other parts of even the English Caribbean, people from Africa are being kept in lifetime human bondage. And so they begin to regulate slavery, pass laws permitting slavery in the 1660s, making slavery hereditary, law by law. It starts to come together to create the system of slavery that we know in the United States. That said, the number of people of African descent was quite small until about 1680. And here's what happened. In the 1680s, slave ownership became more common and slaves began to make up a larger proportion of the colony's population. Before that time, the high mortality rate in Virginia inhibited the growth of slavery because slaves, like all newcomers, were likely to die within the first few years. And English servants in this earlier period had been readily available. They were less expensive than purchasing an enslaved person for life. But in the last quarter of the 17th century, economic and political conditions changed. Fewer English men and women were willing to come to Virginia. Their word of the poor reputation of treatment and opportunity had reached them back in England. And by 1680, there were better options for people in places like my current home state of Pennsylvania, where they could go and maybe have better opportunities as freed people. Then, of course, in 1672, Britain chartered its first slave trading company. And this is sort of the explanation, I think, for why there were fewer slaves before then. The few slaves that arrived in Virginia had come on foreign ships, and they came just occasionally, we'll say in dribs and drabs. Now there was a monopoly company called the Royal African Company that had the right to trade slaves directly to English colonies in the Caribbean and Virginia, and also by this point South Carolina. And one more factor is Bacon's Rebellion of 1676, which was primarily a white servant uprising against the elites. One of the problems with white servants is that they had expectations that their lives would get better. They had the English legal rights, right, of being English-born citizens. And especially right after they got their freedom, they could acquire guns. It made it very easy for them to rebel. And so there's some evidence that the elites in Virginia, in the aftermath of Bacon's Rebellion, said, we need fewer of these white, rebellious, indentured servants. We want a more permanent, dependent labor force that we can easily oppress more easily than the white indentured servants had been. For all of these reasons, we see a much greater increase of slaves in Virginia. There were only a few hundred in the 1670s. By 1700, there were several thousand. So, as slavery developed in the 17th and 18th centuries in Virginia, the Anglican Church was closely tied to this emerging foundation of Southern society. The early Anglican Church in Virginia promoted slavery for its own purposes by renting and buying slaves for the use of its parishes. Anglican parishes were the first institutions in Virginia to own slaves. Some were acquired through deliberate purchase, as I just mentioned, and others through donation. The Anglican success with institutional slaveholding sent Virginians the message that not only was slaveholding not unlawful for a Christian, but that it could benefit them. Later, slaveholding by other Virginia religious denominations, such as the Presbyterians, was probably inspired by the example of the Anglicans. Anglicans employed slaves in two key ways. First, one of the primary goals of the early Anglican Church in Virginia was to recruit more ministers from England. So some of the first Anglican-owned slaves were attached to glebes. And glebes, as you may know, were church-owned lands granted to ministers during their time of service. It's one thing to have land, but without the labor, there's not much value to the land, especially in this period where it wasn't easily rented out. So adding labor, in this case enslaved labor, to the land would improve the value of the living offered to potential ministers and thus attracted more qualified candidates. This was an especially important strategy for Anglicans during and after the American Revolution, when the tithe system broke down during the disestablishment of the church. By the early 19th century, church members, now denominated Episcopalians, sometimes attracted ministers to their parishes by promising the use of church-owned slaves. Another important way that Anglican and Episcopal churches used slave labor was to benefit the poor whites of their parish. Sometimes the income these slaves earned, was used to aid the poor directly, and others were employed in poorhouses, as we're going to learn. Now, we're going to look at this example of Lynnhaven in a minute, but let me give you some background. As slave owners became more common in these parishes as parishioners, pious Anglicans began to donate slaves to their parish, often in their wills. For centuries, faithful members of the Church of England had given gifts to their parish church, such as silver for the communion service or funds to have alms for the poor. Earlier in the 17th century, before slavery is common, we see examples of wealthy Virginia parishioners giving their churches gifts of cattle, which was one of the primary sources of wealth in the new colony. This was a particularly useful gift because the cattle would hopefully reproduce and create an ever-increasing endowment for the use of the parish. As slavery became entrenched in Virginia, many 18th century benefactors began to offer gifts of slaves instead of cattle. As historian Edmund Morgan argues, colonial Virginians quickly recognized that the ownership of slaves combined the best aspects of investments in labor and cattle, just as cattle might reproduce and create a significant endowment in the future. A few slaves could, within a few generations, become a very large endowment of enslaved laborers. Indeed, this proved to be the case in several instances. So the gift of slave labor provided labor immediately, and if it were a woman in her childbearing years, she offered the potential of slave laborers for generations to come. So philanthropy, therefore, was one of the primary ways and earliest ways that slaves came to be owned by Anglican parishes. So the example on the screen, and this is Lynnhaven Parish, Old Donation Church, we have the example of a parishioner in November 1760, Thomas Walk III. He donated 25 acres of, quote, land and swamp to the poor orphans and disabled people of the parish of Lynnhaven, and that is how he spelled it, with the one N. But in his will, he directed the parish vestry, who would be controlling this gift, to sell the land and, quote, the monies arising from the said lands, etc., be by them laid out as soon as possible for breeding Negroes, for the use of or uses aforesaid, that is, for the better help, schooling, and support of the said orphans, etc. So the term breeding Negroes is, of course, very troubling. It's very significant. If they purchase slaves after selling the land, he wants them to buy women of childbearing age, because he's clearly thinking of creating an endowment of slaves for his parish. Land can, if you can find renters, be rented out forever, but an investment in slaves dies with them unless they reproduce themselves. So slave women were the better investment because they could both work immediately and provide offspring to maintain a perpetual endowment for the future. A second way that a Virginia parish frequently acquired slaves was through purchase or hire of slaves by the vestry for the parish's use, especially when they needed laborers for some project they were undertaking. As you probably know, vestrymen were laymen who typically were, in this period at least, elite members of the community. By the 18th century, almost all of them were slaveholders themselves. Like other wealthy men in colonial Virginia, if they needed work done, they thought that they would find slaves to do it. For example, in the second half of the 18th century, a few vestries built poorhouses to care for the indigent, aged, and infirm in their parishes. And then, what may surprise you, is that many purchased or hired slaves to work in them. And you might say, well, why would they hire slaves to work in a poorhouse? But you must realize that the poorhouses weren't just for those who are poor. In fact, usually it wasn't able-bodied people who were there, but usually people who were very old or very sick or very young, those who couldn't take care of their own basic needs. An example of this sort of hire in this case was the upper parish of Nansemond County, which is today, of course, the city of Suffolk, paid over £4 to quote John Streeter for the hire of his Negro woman at the poor's house in November of 1758. So in that case, the parish does not own John Streeter's slave, but they are hiring her for the year to do whatever kind of work, right, that would be called upon for her to do. We can talk a little bit more about the poor here. Poor relief was one of the most important responsibilities of a parish vestry, since all Virginians were required to be members of the Church of England in the colonial era. The parish vestry was responsible for all of the poor whites and occasionally free blacks in their community who were in need. The far more numerous population of poor black slaves received no help from them. They were the responsibilities of their owners and received no parish aid. A large percentage of the text of the surviving Virginia vestry books, I can tell you, is devoted to the poor, answering questions like who would receive relief, what would they be given, and sometimes why they needed it. This was one of the most significant expenses right after the minister's salary and maintenance of the parish properties. Until the middle of the 18th century, most Virginia poor received gifts of money or food directly that enabled them to continue living at home. Those who were unable to care for themselves, such as the very young or the very old, were assigned to live with someone, including a member of their own extended family, or often a neighbor, and the parish reimbursed that family member or neighbor for taking care of them. Now, in the middle of the, sorry, I'm just trying to decide which parts to share with you. I think I will skip ahead just a little bit. Let's talk about the economic benefit to the parish. When the work of slaves paid for part or all of the burden of poor relief, it reduced the amount of mandatory tithes the vestry needed to charge members of their congregation each year. Ownership of slaves was not without its own expenses, however. There are small expenses that the church vestry books contain, including paying the fee for a midwife, for a woman who gives birth who belongs to a parish. There were other occasional doctor's bills or burial costs. But as the birth of the slave child reveals, this investment could also ultimately be a lucrative one. As the parents grew older, children would take over for them. And I also did want to share with you, among the work that slaves did in the poorhouses is they would do that hands-on physical care for people, the way that we might think of people in assisted living or nursing homes would do today. But they would also be responsible for cooking and cleaning and bathing, maintaining the houses, and sometimes even farming outside the building to feed the residents. Most of these poorhouses were on farms, and the creators of the poorhouse envisioned that some of the people living in the poorhouse would work the farms, but in reality, it was almost always slave labor because very few able-bodied poor would end up there. Let's take another example. Another example of how parishes came to control the labor of African Americans, in this case, not technically slaves, but nearly so, is the example of Matthew Ashby, and in this case, the Bruton Parish Church. And the image that you see, it looks modern because it is. These are interpreters from colonial Williamsburg portraying a free Black family of Matthew Ashby, his wife Anne in the background, and son John. Matthew Ashby, as I know, was one of many people of color required by a 1691 Virginia law to serve the parish of his birth until he was 31 years old. And that was because he was a mixed race child, referred to in the records as a mulatto, born to a white mother. So let me read to you a little bit more about this. So many parishes gained temporary control over free African Americans who were born to white mothers and Black or mixed race fathers. A law passed by the Virginia House of Burgesses in 1691 and renewed in 1705 penalized white mothers of mixed race children. A free white mother with a, quote, mulatto child had a hefty fine of 15 pounds, and if she could not pay that sum, she would be sold as an indentured servant for a term of 5 years. If the mother was already an indentured servant at the time of the child's birth, she also had to serve an extra 2 years to the master who controlled her servitude, which was the ordinary penalty for bearing a child while a servant. Then she was sold for her 5-year term for bearing a mixed race child for a total of 7 years. But in either case, whether she could afford the 15-pound fee or not, her child would be technically free because slavery followed the condition of the mother according to Virginia law. If the mother was free, no matter her race, the child would be free. If the mother was enslaved, no matter the race of the mother or the father, right, then the child would be a slave. However, as noted on the screen, the 1691 and 1705 laws stipulated that these free children of color would have to work as servants for the benefit of the parish in which they were born until they reached the age of 31. Historian Howard Bodenhorn, states that although the law may have called it servitude, most people in the colonial era viewed the children's punishment as slavery, if only for a term of years. Many masters, however, ignored the term limitation and kept servants in lifetime bondage. So serving basically from their earliest years through the age of 31, that's an enormous percentage of their lifetime. And there were many people caught in this situation. But one who's very well documented is Matthew Ashby of Williamsburg, which is why he's interpreted at colonial Williamsburg. He was born in 1727 to a white indentured servant named Mary Ashby. His father's an unknown African American. Following the law, he labored as a servant for the financial benefit of Bruton Parish Church for 30 plus years. During these years in Williamsburg, he was trained and worked as both a carter and a carpenter. He gained respect as a trustworthy man. He was chosen even to be a messenger for Governor Botetourt, carrying diplomatic papers to Western Virginia on the governor's behalf. The connections he was able to make with powerful men in the colonial capital proved beneficial when, in 1769, he was given permission by the governor's council to free his wife and 2 young children, all slaves whom he had purchased earlier that year from their owner, Samuel Spur, for 150 pounds. So let me just pause there for a minute. So Matthew Ashby eventually got his freedom and earned enough money, and I have to tell you, 150 pounds is a lot of money, but he purchased his wife and children who were slaves of a man named Samuel Spur. But then he couldn't just free them. He literally was the owner of his wife and children until he got permission from the General Assembly to free them. Virginia had passed a law making it illegal for any slaveholder to free his or her slaves. And that's not going to change until the American Revolution. So let me just note, although the quote-unquote mulatto servants of the parish, like Matthew Ashby, were not slaves for life, they were treated as slaves in many ways because of the protracted length of their service and the color of their skin. And while Matthew Ashby has a pretty good end story because he's able to develop some skills, because he's living in the capital, make some connections, and ultimately frees his wife and children, most people in this situation were not as fortunate. Now, parishes employed slaves in a variety of ways, but one of the most common was to assign slaves to work the glebe that the vestry provided for the benefit of the minister. Colonial Anglican churches paid their ministers a salary of 16,000 pounds of tobacco per annum, and they also provided him with a glebe, which usually included at least 100 acres of land and a house suitable to his station in society. The glebe remained the property of the parish, but the minister had the right to farm the glebe for his own personal use and profit. Virginia was a world in which landowning planters were at the top of the social hierarchy. And in that kind of world, it was important for a parish minister to be a planter as well as a preacher. In the Anglican Church, ministers were considered part of the gentry class because of their education and sacred responsibilities, but the power structure of Virginia demanded that they be independently wealthy to earn the kind of respect that ministers tended to feel was their due. As historian Rhys Isaac notes, a man's title to gentility could only be secured by the accumulation of an estate, or in the case of a clergyman, by the establishment of a benefice. This benefice was the glebe. And when a minister was formally inducted as parish minister, which means given lifetime tenure, he had a right to the benefice as long as he lived. However, it never became his property and he couldn't pass it down to his children. So the glebe often contained substantial acreage, but as I noted earlier, was virtually worthless to a minister unless someone farmed the land for him. In some parishes, the minister would rent out glebes to tenant farmers, but there weren't that many tenants available because there was so much land, that was seemingly cheap and easy to acquire, except maybe in all but the most easternmost parishes. And so, like the gentleman planters in his own congregation, ministers in 18th century Virginia would not literally go out and farm the glebe property himself, but he would employ slave labor to grow tobacco and food crops on the glebe. Most ministers eventually owned a few slaves of their own. Some owned a significant number of slaves by the end of the colonial era. For example, 35 slaves owned by the Reverend Price Davies in 1782 made him the 5th largest slave owner in Lynnhaven Parish, which straddled New Kent and James City counties. Similarly, the Reverend James Craig of Cumberland Parish, with 42 slaves and over 1,500 acres of land, was one of the leading planters of Lunenburg County in the 1780s. But we know from the example of Anthony Gavin that not everyone approved of this. And Anthony Gavin is an example of a man who didn't grow wealthy. When he died, his wife, Rachel, was left virtually nothing, and in fact was supported by the poor relief system of her parish for the last few years of her life. But because it seemed so necessary that ministers have slave labor to employ on their glebes, some parishes started providing ministers with both a glebe and parish-owned slaves to work it, beginning in the early 18th century. And this is where James Blair comes in. That's the statue you've been looking at on your screen while I've been talking. The statue of James Blair located on the campus of the College of William and Mary. I used to walk by him every day on my way to classes there. He was the founder of the College of William and Mary, which of course was a college established for educating Anglican clergymen. He was also commissary of the Church of England in Virginia, which meant he was the highest ranking minister and the one basically acting on behalf of the Bishop of London. And I think significantly, the originator of the idea of using slaves to support both religious and educational institutions. From everything I've been able to suss out in looking at the records, I believe he's the first to suggest that any institution in Virginia owns slaves. So on the next slide, I've got a quote from him and another painting, maybe a little more attractive than that statue. As commissary of the Bishop of London, he felt that it was very important to try to recruit better ministers. The problem was, again, and William and Mary has just only been founded 6 years earlier, with the idea of trying to train, homegrown ministers, but still most Anglican ministers had to be recruited from England. And there were usually better options for them in England. And it wasn't very attractive to come out to Virginia. And so he complained that they were getting the worst ministers, which is sort of horrible. But in 1699, he sent a letter to the Bishop of London titled, "A proposition for supplying Virginia with a sufficient number of much better clergymen." He was looking for a solution. Virginians complained about the quality of their clergymen from England. And those in the vestries continually complained that Britain sent over only those ministers who could not find a parish to serve in England, and that those who came were lazy and morally lax. Thus, the vestries justified their habit of not inducting the ministers. In other words, not giving them tenure and that sort of lifetime of security. Instead, they would, break with English tradition and just hire them basically on annual contracts. That denied them financial security, and it made Virginia seem like an even worse place for Englishmen to go if they weren't going to be given tenure. Blair recognized this tactic was self-defeating if vestries really wanted more qualified ministers. And so he also was worried that it was hard for the sons of the Virginia gentry to be recruited into the ministry if their livelihood would be so uncertain. After all, why had Blair founded William and Mary in 1693 if not to recruit more ministers from home? So his proposal was simple. The vestry, he said, anytime there was no minister in the parish, which was often, right, where they were in between ministers waiting for new ones to come from England, the vestry would still collect the tithes, that 16,000 pounds of tobacco that they would have paid the minister. And he said they should use it to stock the glebe, and here's our quote, with, quote, 4 or 5 Negroes under an overseer, and with a stock of cattle of 7 or 8 milk cows and calves for the use of the minister. After the parish had acquired this to attach to the glebe, he wanted them to use the remaining money as it came in to purchase library books for the use of the minister, and then finally to save money to pay for the moving expenses from Britain. Finally, when all that had been accomplished, he thought that the funds from empty parishes should be used to buy slaves, cattle, books, etc., for neighboring parishes until every parish in Virginia had been supplied with these, quote, essentials. So Blair felt that by improving these benefices, that this plan would be, quote, a most effectual expedient for furnishing this country with a learned, pious, and diligent clergy. Now, as it happens, the House of Burgesses never supported this plan. He pushed for it to be voted into law to require it, and it never was passed. However, gradually, the idea took hold, and parishes, individually adopted something similar to Blair's plan. In 1724, so 25 years after Blair's letter, The Bishop of London sent a questionnaire out to all the ministers in Virginia, asking them lots of different questions about their parishes and their work there. I have to say that the answers that were sent back to London are just a wealth of interesting information about the colonial Anglican Church. But one of the questions was about the value of their glebe, whether or not they had a house there, and of the 30 surviving responses to the questionnaire, not one of the ministers reported having the use of a parish-owned slave. But within a few years afterward, there is a lot of evidence that parishes were adding slaves to their glebe. So it does seem that vestries were making small investments, we'll say, in slave labor. And we do see a lot of evidence in the middle of the 18th century of this. An early example is the vestry of Elizabeth City Parish, today in the city of Hampton, which had received, they'd recently purchased a new glebe property for their minister, and they asked permission to sell the old property for the benefit of the parish. In August of 1734, the General Assembly required that once they had sold the old glebe land, the funds, quote, be laid out and applied by them in purchasing slaves to be placed upon the new glebe, and such slaves and their increase, so long as any of them shall be living, shall remain upon the said glebe for the use and benefit of the present parson and the parson of the said parish for the time being forever, end quote. And we have many other examples of that too that I could duplicate. In Hunger's Parish in Northampton County, Virginia, also required to invest in slave labor. Also Ware Parish in Gloucester County, and just looking at many examples of this. There are many examples where the burgesses specifically mention women as slaves. For example, with the case of Ware Parish, quote, they permitted the sale of land for the purchase of buying slaves, quote, 1/2 of which shall be young females, which were then attached to the glebe permanently. They were, saying that half had to be young females because they wanted to create an endowment that would have the potential to increase for generations, or as they put it, forever. As in the case of Thomas Watt III's will in Lynnhaven Parish, the General Assembly was thinking of, quote unquote, breeding Negroes who would be both productive and reproductive in their value to the church. Now, all of these examples that we've been looking at in the Anglican and Episcopal churches are examples of what I've called institutional slavery. The term institutional slave describes someone who's owned by a group of individuals working together for a common religious, charitable, or even a corporate economic purpose, rather than an individual master or mistress. Institutional slaveholding was a very important financial support for early churches, helping to support ministers, to pay for the poor, and all the different things that we've talked about, and more that we haven't, like the establishment of schools for white children, especially poor children, the support of orphans, and as we've hinted, also the establishment of William and Mary, where they also used slave labor to run the everyday business of that college, another extension of the Anglican Church and slaveholding. And as I alluded before, this practice of slave owning by groups did eventually extend to many other groups outside of the Anglican Church. The situations of slaves who were owned by institutions was in some ways worse than those owned by individuals. And that's something that we haven't touched on as much as I would like in the talk today, which is focused a little bit more on the nuts and bolts of it. But those who were owned by institutions sometimes face terrible situations. I'll just summarize one for you quickly, and I definitely do want to leave time for questions and discussion. But in this example of In this case, it was a schoolmaster who was being supported by a slave who was owned by the school. So he controlled her everyday living and working conditions, but he didn't own her. He just benefited from her labor. Well, there was a big debate over who should provide her a new set of winter's clothes. It's way back in the 1690s. And it went all the way to court. And the court ordered the schoolmaster that he had to provide for them. And in the court record, they never mentioned her name, but they do mention she was, quote, almost naked. And they specifically laid out all the things he had to buy for her because he was the one benefiting from her labor, and that it wasn't the responsibility of the trustees of the school. So there's a case where the most basic needs of slaves often weren't met because they were in control of someone who didn't have a long-term interest in their well-being. Even a minister who might expect to control the labor of a slave during his whole rest of his life and career may have less concern about their long-term welfare because he can't pass, say, the children on to his own heirs. And there are even worse situations for those who are working, for example, in the poorhouses, where they are responsible for caring for people who can't care for themselves. But then at the same time, they're also in this inferior position in society. There had to be this constant tension, I imagine, working there and being a slave, but also being in charge of the poorhouse with and taking care of people and trying to tell them what they needed to do. It's just a terrible situation. There's a lot more that could be said. And again, I just want to emphasize that the ownership of slaves was carried out by many different church congregations, by free schools and colleges, including there's the University of Virginia, as well as my own William and Mary and other schools like Hampton, Sydney. State and local level governments owned slaves. That's a whole nother story for another day. And a lot of businesses own slaves as corporate entities. Now, just to conclude, given all the ways that communal slave ownership benefited members of a parish, it's not surprising that slave ownership by Anglican churches in Virginia was widespread. In my survey of all the surviving Virginia vestry books and other sources like parish registers and acts of the General Assembly, it's clear that at least half of the parishes owned slaves at some time during the 18th or 19th century. And I will point out, we haven't talked as much about it in the 19th century, and that is because many times with the disestablishment of the churches, the slaves that were owned by the parish were literally taken away and auctioned off, which, it's its own kind of horror for those who are enslaved and involved in that. And so at that point, many of the new Episcopal churches had to start over. So we see a sort of reduction in slave ownership at that point. But for those parishes that did continue to own slaves, it was a very important way that they continued to fund their work, as I noted earlier, after the disestablishment. So I will say, as far as how extensive it was, most of these parish records are incomplete. Sometimes they are lost. And sometimes they're just tantalizing small references to slave ownership in sources that otherwise tell us so little about their lives. And that's something I wish I could do with this topic, is tell you more about the individuals and about their lives. And the records just don't give us that information. But a great example of these sort of tantalizing small references is the baptism register of Bruton Parish in Williamsburg. In 1767, they report the birth of Thomas, son of Molly, belonging to the parish. But Bruton Parish has no further records about either Thomas or Molly or any other slaves it may have owned. It's impossible to know the details of their lives or how they were employed by the parish. All we know for certain is that they were there. The older parishes in the eastern half of the colony, like Bruton Parish, were more likely to own slaves than the western parishes in the Piedmont and beyond. And this is surely because there were many more wealthy planters in the Tidewater, Virginia who had larger numbers of slaves and thus the means to endow their parishes with slaves. I just want to conclude too by saying that I think it's important to recognize the very important foundation for these churches and the schools and colleges that they founded, etc., all laid on the work of enslaved laborers. Much of Virginia's earliest philanthropic and religious efforts was undergirded by the labor of slaves. And so we should remember that they were there from the very beginning and were deeply, deeply concerned with the success of all these institutions, often unknowingly and unwittingly, but very much responsible for their success and financial stability nonetheless. So I'd like to thank you for listening, and I'd like to leave the remaining about 10 minutes for any questions or comments that you may have. And I know that there are some in the chat, and I'm just going to maybe turn that back over to Lynn to introduce those who have questions. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Oast. That was fascinating. Just a couple questions in the chat. There's one from Malcolm Higgins asking, is there evidence that the vestry of Lynnhaven Parish followed the bequest of Thomas Wake III to sell the 25 acres he devised by his will to acquire breeding Negroes for an endowment?
Yes, oh, I see the question too. That is a very good question. I tried very hard to track that down. I can tell you that Lynnhaven Parish definitely owns slaves. I cannot tell for sure if those slaves had been purchased through the walk endowment. And so there's that disconnect. There's the discussion of the will and the walk endowment, and then say like 20 years later, there's a reference to slaves owned by the parish. To me, it makes sense that they probably are connected, but they may not have been. And ultimately, I think the significance, at least that we can take away for sure, is that Walk and others thought that this was a good plan for funding their church. Great question. And looking at the remaining comments there, how did joint ownership of an institutional slave occur? Good question. Okay, so basically, the institution would almost always have some sort of, in the case of Anglican churches, the vestry, or a board of directors maybe, or the faculty of a college, and they would be given the responsibility for purchasing and managing slave labor. So in that case, just the way corporations are set up today and own property in common and no one person owns the property, that would be the same situation with those who were enslaved. And the problem, as I implied before with that example of the woman owned by the free school, is that there would be lots of different people who would claim a sort of ownership of the person, the right to tell them what to do, the work to give them, the right of punishing them. But very few people who would feel the responsibility for taking care of their needs, right? In fact, the degree to which institutional slaves had their basic needs met entirely determined by just humanity and sense of responsibility that say the vestry or the board of trustees would have. And if they didn't have a very good sense of that, they could be exploited or abused or starved. One good example of that, and this is not from the church, but during the American Revolution, slaves who attempted to run away and were captured by the Patriot Army became property of the state. And then they were put to all kinds of wartime uses. But there was this one case of a man who was assigned a group of state slaves, public slaves, And instead of putting them to public use, he was using them, to enrich himself, to work on his own farm and plantation. And then he was, put on trial for that, which is why we know about it. But there was a lot of opportunity for abuse of institutional slaves. And then the third question, is there any record of slavery in what is now West Virginia? Yes, there was a lot of slavery. Okay, not a lot. There was some slavery throughout West Virginia. And of course, until the Civil War, it's all just Virginia, right? But the further west you go, the less common slavery was. So especially once you get to the Shenandoah Valley and past the Shenandoah Valley, you do not see a very large percentage of the population being enslaved, which is part of the reason why the counties that make up West Virginia broke off from the rest of Virginia. When Virginia seceded, of course, they did not want to follow because slavery wasn't an important issue to them. And that, of course, is why Virginia seceded, is to try to protect the system of slavery. And so those counties that make up West Virginia said, no, we don't want to secede. We want to stay in the Union. And so the short answer is, yes, there are records of slavery in West Virginia, but it's not as common. And as far as slave owning by churches in West Virginia, that is a question that I actually haven't researched enough to tell you for sure. So thank you. And I see this question from Sandra Smith. What year was the sale of the glebe by Elizabeth City Parish? Let me look that up really fast in my notes. I hope it's fast. I had this prepared talking, and then I realized I was going to have to skip through some paragraphs. And so sorry about that. Oh, okay, so 1734. August 1734, that is when the General Assembly of Virginia required that when they did sell the land, that they had to use those funds to purchase slaves to attach to the glebe. And then, can you tell us whether the Anglican clergy had a religious justification for enslaving other humans? The answer in this period, the colonial era that we've mostly focused on today, is no. They did not have a religious justification, and that's because they didn't feel need to justify it. Although it's hard to grasp today, there weren't that many English people questioning slavery at all in the colonial era. People really don't start to question it in large numbers until the time of the American Revolution, when they are inspired by things like, the Declaration of Independence saying all men are created equal, and this idea that they are fighting for freedom, and in that case, can they be hypocrites and keep others in slavery? If all people have a right to life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness, how can they continue with slavery? And there are other reasons too why the revolution made them question slavery in large numbers for the first time. But in this era, no, people were sort of raised to accept that everybody was born into a hierarchy. Some people are going to be born at the top, like the king and the nobility, and others would be born in the middle and others at the bottom. Even a God-given hierarchy that you weren't supposed to question. And the way I sometimes explain it to my students is, you see people writing about slavery as if it's just one of those horrible things that people are plagued with, but there's nothing you can do about it. Like thunderstorms and the measles, right? It's just part of the world. And so it was just so common, and so many people just accepted it. Like I said, there were exceptions. We've got Anthony Gavin being forward thinking. We've got Quakers who already in the colonial era are questioning slavery. But most Anglicans are not. They're not even thinking they need a justification. It's just the way it is. I found one, and this wasn't a minister, it was a slave trader who wrote that he tried to treat the slaves on his slave ships the way he would want to be treated if he were a slave. But he didn't question the legitimacy of slavery. He just felt as long as he was doing his best to not treat them unduly harsh, that he was doing what God wanted him to do. So, yeah, it's strange. It's strange to get into the heads of people who think so differently from ourselves. But that's what we're seeing when we read what they have written at the time. These are great questions. Are there more? Well, I know time is short. One thing I'm going to do right now is I'm putting in my email address in the chat. I think I just sent that only to Lynn. I'm sorry. Let me send it to everyone. If there's anyone who has questions and they feel short on time, ask them, or they don't want to ask them in the public forum, I'd be glad to correspond with you via email. So feel free to write me at jost@bloomU.edu. But thank you so much for your kind attention today and your interest in the topic.
Thank you so much for your time tonight. I knew some bits and pieces, but didn't have it all strung together. And I even commented to a colleague, gives a whole new lens on stewardship, doesn't it? When you think about how it all began and how slavery was used as a stewardship tool. But we certainly appreciate your time. For the good of the order, any last minute questions before we send you off? Willis, could I ask you to close us out with a short prayer?
Yeah. The Lord be with you. Heavenly Father, thank you for the knowledge that was imparted to us tonight. Help it make us aware of our shortcomings and the work that we need to do. Help us to understand that racist ideas and racism can potentially lead to genocide. Help us to lean on you and your Son and the Holy Spirit to enable us to fight for the freedom of all people, to stand up for justice and equality, to act on the knowledge that we have been given tonight, and to do what God wills us to do, to walk humbly with God, to do justice, and help everyone to live into the boundless life, the life abundant that God declares and wishes for all people. Amen.
Thank you, Willis. Dr. Oast, thank you so much for your time. We certainly appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you for that beautiful prayer.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, y'all. Have a safe evening.
Good night.
Good night.
Jennifer, I was going to put up my husky background, but I didn't.
Oh, that would have been fun.
When I was at Bloomsburg, my building overlooked Carver Hall, so I lived in Elwell, and
Oh, well, that's right still there, no?
Yep.
That's where that is. I don't know when the last time was you came up, but there's a lot of new construction.
yes, I was up probably a year and a half ago, and as a matter of fact, have to come through this weekend because we have a house in Nordmont, so maybe 35 miles away. And so I frequently make a stop at the bookstore, have to do it.
I will tell you, the bookstore is closed right now.
Is it? Oh, that makes me sad.
People have to order things especially from it, and then they deliver it because of COVID, unfortunately.
Great.
Yeah, but there's a brand new building going up on the quad, and that's actually where the history department is going to move to. So we're excited.
Oh, excellent. Excellent. Well, it
Yeah,
looks
that's
like maybe,
awesome.
I don't know if some people are staying around to ask some questions, so I'll be quiet since you're hanging and
Yes, I'd be glad to have more conversation.
This is Bob Randall. I'm from Old Nation Church in Virginia Beach, and so I was there. I am okay. Yeah. Anyway, I appreciated your comments about the walks and the subtle teasers that are in vestry records, because that's how we started discovering our own history.
Mhm.
Was with parish historians really just painstakingly reading through vestry records and then discovering a couple of names that that there was no story about, but it was really interesting. I've been the rector there 16 years now, and I didn't realize that the records they had found were sitting in a book on my coffee table in my office.
Wow.
So it's been fascinating.
That's exactly how I did this research. Is I started getting every published vestry book. A lot of them were published, like even 100 years ago. Most of them don't have indexes, so it's just sitting and reading and looking for any clues and taking notes and trying to put together the stories. But there's always so much more we wish we could learn.
Yeah, it was very helpful to hear you tell some of the stories that you have uncovered, and to know how difficult it is actually to uncover some of these stories, because they're not the ones the parish likes to tell, so.
No, a lot of them aren't, they're not beautiful stories, but it's so important to know this history, I think. Once I started stumbling across it as a graduate student, all I wanted to do is just try to contextualize it all and just understand it,
Right. Yep. We had probably 4 or 5 or 6 members of our parish on the session with you tonight. So we were well represented, because it really has brought an awareness that that I think most people, had not ever recognized before. So it's really good work. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And is that your family behind you in your picture?
Actually, those are all teenagers I took on a pilgrimage. That was on a picture of a ferry leaving Dover and going to Calais 2 years ago with, we had a group of about 14 high schoolers on the pilgrimage. So,
Oh, that must have been wonderful.
Oh, it is one of the great blessings of our work here. About every other year, we've taken usually about a dozen kids on pilgrimage. This year, unfortunately, we didn't get to go to Ireland, where we had all the plans made, but someday we'll get there again. So
I hope so.
Yep, for sure. And I had a roommate in college who grew up in Shippensburg State, and his girlfriend, now wife, 40 years later, was a student at Bloomsburg at the time. So,
cool.
Cool.
And Shippensburg is one of our sister schools. So Bloomsburg and Shippensburg are part of the state system of higher education.
Yep. All good. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yep. That's good.
Does anybody else who's still on the meeting have questions? I'm not
Okay.
seeing anybody jump in. All right, we're gonna go ahead and end the meeting, and thanks, Bob. Glad
you.
so many folks from Old Nation could join us.
Yeah, well, it was a blessing. It was a good night. That's for sure.
Thank you. And Lynn, thank you so much for inviting me.
Oh, thank you for saying yes. We really do appreciate it. The Repairs Group has mean, you are kicking off our speaker series. We're trying to have periodic lectures and opportunities for people to dig deeper and to really do some truth telling. And I think that was a huge part of what you talked about tonight. You know, I kept thinking, I never thought of the early church looking at stewardship in this way, but there was an element of that, which was an aha for me. So I just so appreciate you sharing your gifts with us, and we may give you another call if you're willing to do part 2.
Anytime. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. You have a good evening and stay safe and enjoy those fall leaves. Are they turning? Are the leaves changing?
Absolutely.
Excellent. Well, that will give me something to look forward to when I drive through town. I will wave to you, and I'll be sending you something in the mail just to thank you for your time tonight. So many thanks. Blessings.
Thank you so much.
All right. You take
Good night,
care.
everyone. Bye-bye.